Listen, 2021, at least in this country, is off to a worse start than 2020, and there are reasons for these things. We need to talk. Welcome to Prohibition Theology. My name is Torsten Moritz. My PhD is in theology and interpretation. We need to look into this. What's happening here? The title of this video is Christians, Truth, and Biblical Theology, a Troubled Relationship. That's the understatement of the century. Now think about this. If you're a theologian, then you have known for some time that there is a troubled relationship between what Christians claim to be thinking and believing and what they often actually do believe, and even more so how it translates into real life and into their politics and all sorts of other things, relationships and whatnot. The real shocker in 2020 has been that Christians don't know what to do with truth. I'm not talking about content so much here, whether this claim or that claim is true. I mean, underlying all that, I mean the stuff that underpins it all. If I go to the theater and I watch this play, I'm just as interested in what happens behind the seats. I look up, I wish I could look behind. You look underneath, there's an orchestra down there. That's the stuff that makes everything happen. And that's what I'm talking about here. Christians have a real problem with truth on that level. They don't have a problem leaning back and looking at things and pontificating about the truth of this and the truth of that. But the systemics, how stuff actually works, underneath and behind and surrounding it, that is where Christians have a huge problem. All right, so it's this crazy relationship. Christians and biblical theology, Christians and truth, The thinking wing of Christianity, that would be the schools of theology, seminaries where the leaders go, actually where the leaders used to go, because now a lot of churches hire people that don't have that at all, which is very telling, but that's for another day. So those schools on the one hand and churches on the other hand have really grown apart, and they have grown apart for a very long time. So there's very little that connects. The person actually who has to make the connection ultimately is that pastor who just graduated seminary, is now in church, is left alone by the seminary, except when it's time to ask for a donation for the seminary, once a year and maybe on special occasions. And then on the church side, that pastor, he or she somehow has to make it work, and he or she realizes, whoa, this isn't really at all how I thought it would be. Nor has my education really prepared me for this. I think we have essentially three problems here, and they apply to both wings here. The theological side, the educational side, if you will, professional side, whatever you want to call it, seminaries and whatnot, and on the other hand, the church side, where the rubber hits the road, at least in those four walls that keep Christians isolated from the world. So, number one, Christians tend to have a pick and choose attitude. So to take these two examples of truth in general and biblical theology in particular, Christians will just pick and choose. They'll pick whatever theological parts, at least their understanding thereof, of the Bible fits their paradigm in terms of how they conceive of truth in general. They pick and choose. And by doing that, we don't really take care of notions of truth at all, which is why in 2020, we had this shocking outing of many Christians, especially the more conservative ones, who used to present themselves as the stalwarts of truth. And suddenly they're quite okay to walk away from that notion and to go with, you've guessed it, fake news, and apparently don't have a problem with it. Why not? Well, that's one of the other two problems. So there's three, I said. So the first one, the pick and choose attitude. On the biblical theology side, it's the same thing. People look at the Bible, or at least they have the Bible somehow mediated to them by the people at the front who talk about the Bible, or who lead the Bible study, or who appear on television, some Christian program after Law and Order, late at night, or something like that. They look at that what the Bible has to offer, and they're extremely picky and choosy about the bits they like and the bits that are left out. The true left behind story right there. Okay, so number one was picking and choosing, and that does not work very well. Why would anyone fall for that other than the people who are actually doing it already? Number two, Christian institutions. They are power structure like any other institution. There's a reason, and by the way, I talked about this in the last two videos extensively. There's a reason why Jesus moved believers away from the institution into the realm of relationships and says that is where ultimately problems are rooted and need to be fixed. And institutions aren't capable of doing that because they're in the business of power and power politics, and churches and seminaries are no different. Ask me how I know. Okay, so I do blame institutions. Now let me tell you, I've had a lot of students, many thousands, and some of them have told me, and they still tell me today sometimes, on Messenger or Facebook or something. They tell me that I have a problem with institutions. And I think, and your point is what? Well, the point usually is that people expect each other and Christians expect each other, and the question is that a good idea or not? Expect each other to somehow take the high ground. So when you see an institution that is really messing up, even and especially if it's a Christian institution, you're somehow supposed to turn a blind eye. And the problem, well, a lot of problems with that, but the major problem I have with that is it really damages people. And I would much prefer that we went for the people, we did things in favor of the people, for the benefit of the people, instead of worrying about institutions so much. As a Christian, I'm more interested in people than institutions, but power politics makes that almost impossible. You see that in the New Testament, and you see how Jesus massively reacts against power politics by the institution. Do Christian institutions talk about that? I don't think so. I've been a seminary prof for many years. I've taught in universities also. You know what? In universities, you can actually talk about this. I mean, real universities, the kind with a capital U. You can talk about this. The Christian institutions, not so much, in my experience. You want to know how I know that? Ask me, and I will tell you. Okay, third reason. I said there are three reasons. We do not get knowledge. We suck at knowledge. We're awful at it. And I find that really troubling. Knowledge is something, knowledge and truth, and who cares about definitions? People are always obsessed with definitions. Definitions are like, clothing labels. I don't go around and say to people, look at my label back there. No, this is what I'm wearing right here. I don't know why people are obsessed with definitions, but that, by the way, is a great example of us not getting knowledge. People think definitions are a thing. They're not. They're stupid labels. And they can be more appropriate or less appropriate, more true or less true, but they're not a thing. Knowledge is a thing. How does knowledge work? Well, let's bring an exhibit out here. Let's take, let me think, the Transcendent, because we're talking about Christians, right? So we're talking about theology and we're talking about the Transcendent. So when I became a professor, I used to be a professor in universities before I became a professor in seminaries. And when I became a professor in seminaries, one of the astonishing things that hit me early on was, if you point out some obvious things about our talk, our interaction with the Transcendent and our claims about the Transcendent, people look at you and go, what? Like, you're rocking my world. What are you talking about? And by the way, I blame the educational system for that a great deal. Not the teachers, but the system. I blame what's called the epistemology of education for that. But be that as it may, the reality is, if you point out, for instance, that even Christians cannot speak literally about the Transcendent, people are in shock. Nobody, including Christians, can talk about the Transcendent, the otherworldly, that which is beyond us, if you will, literally. And people go, why not? Don't we have the Spirit? Doesn't the Holy Spirit make this possible for us? No. No. We're still limited. What we can do is we can talk about the transcendent as if it were not transcendent, but it's still transcendent. And I still cannot understand it literally or talk about it literally. I can just pretend. In other words, I can recognize my limitation and I can say, since I cannot talk about the transcendent literally, because then it wouldn't be transcendent, right? I mean, this is not rocket science. I could say, since I cannot talk about the transcendent literally, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use the means that I do have, and I'm going to talk about the transcendent as if it were not transcendent. That's the best I can do. You know, I kind of, it's like talking about something without looking at it. And it's the first time you see it. Well, you don't see it. You look past it because you have to. There's a bit of a wall, but you have an inkling. There's something over there. Now, we can pretend we see it and we can talk quote unquote literally, but that doesn't mean that thing is like that. What's the point of calling it transcendent, supernatural, if we then don't recognize that and sort of pull it in as if we could actually talk about it literally? It makes no sense at all. But that happens in Christianity day in, day out, week in, week out, on the seminary side as well as on the church side. And that is deeply troubling. The funny thing is this. Christians will quite happily understand that piece when they talk about non-Christians or adherents of other religions. And they will say things like, well, they don't have the Holy Spirit, and they don't have Jesus in their heart, and they don't have this, and they don't have that. And theologians might say they don't have the right systematic theology, which is an extremely strange animal anyway, but another episode. So they're quite happy to understand this as far as it applies to other people. But then, of course, they claim the big exception. I suppose it's a Christian version of exceptionalism. You know how many Americans claim that America is exceptional compared to all other countries. And so Christians have a version of that. And that version is, people can't understand the transcendent. People cannot talk literally about the transcendent, but we can. You know what? A few years ago, I was at a conference, and somebody asked me about this because I had published an article about it, and then I responded to that person. It was a research student, and the advisor of that research student knew that he had told the student something very different from what I had said in that article. Now, that shouldn't be a problem normally. I mean, we just talk about it, and if we agree, we agree. If we don't, we don't, whatever. But we got to be able to talk about it openly. Now, the advisor of that student ended up suggesting in that conversation in Atlanta, it was in Atlanta, it's coming back to me, ended up suggesting in that conversation that maybe language, I can't remember if he meant a particular language, I think he meant language as a notion, as a human thing that we do, that maybe that was created by God specifically to help Christians to speak literally about the transcendent, but in such a way that non-Christians cannot... What? If that's how far we have to go, then, oh my word, we are in worse trouble than I even thought. Christians do not have that particular privilege of peeking literally into the transcendent, whereas the rest of the world does not. That's just arrogance, and that's just fundamentalism, and it's kind of a particularly tainted fundamentalism, a certain Christian fundamentalism, and hey, we have to do better than that. It's embarrassing. Now, if it's embarrassing in the academic world, then the embarrassing thing in the church world is that this doesn't even exist. This question doesn't even exist. Now, the students, I have to say, and my students, I've always been so amazed how willing a lot of students were to recognize that we need to tackle this. We need to talk about this stuff. And so they showed an openness. And, I've had students who said, interesting, but this is not for me. This is not what I went to seminary for. And maybe I never saw them again. Well, in the hallway or for coffee or something, but not in the classroom. But most students I would see again and again and again, because they said, this is fundamentally human stuff, whether we call it epistemology or we call it knowledge or we call it truth stuff or whatever we want to call it. This is pretty foundational stuff. And it should live in churches as much as it should live in the academy. And it seems to me it doesn't have much of a place to live either here or there. Today I've talked more about this epistemology thing, about knowing stuff. So a couple of examples where this really matters. Number one, the resurrection. When Christians talk about the resurrection of Jesus, they're in this weird place where they make literal claims and transcendent claims, and they claim to be able to talk literally about the transcendent. How's that going to work? If it's literal, how can it ever reach the transcendent? If it's truly transcendent, how can we claim to be talking about literally? People ask questions like, where's the body? Well, the body kind of took off and went somewhere else, to another dimension somewhere, a transcendent dimension. Okay, but then you're still asked as a sort of faith test, do you believe that that resurrected body is literal? Well, which is it? Am I being asked about the transcendent, in which case I cannot make literal statements? Or am I asked about something literal in case we're not talking about the transcendent? Okay, now there's a lot more to say about this, but that's an example where this kind of discussion matters. Very briefly, another one, angel talk. After the exiles in the Old Testament, when Israel ended up in, for instance, the Babylonian exile, and they saw these hosts of soldiers and whatnot protecting the empire and protecting the leader of the empire and whatnot, not by coincidence, right after that in the Old Testament, you start having a lot of angel talk. It was probably inspired by what they saw in the exile. Does that mean that we're now able to talk about some other beings? They're not God and they're not human, but somehow they're literal? You see, where it gets problematic is not only in terms of recognizing our own limitations, which is a very healthy thing, at least it would be if we did, but where this gets troubling is when Christians talk to non-Christians and they want to sign up non-Christians to their particular mix of the literal and the quasi-literal and the transcendental and the quasi-transcendental, and if the other person has questions about it, then the Christian kind of says, it's a matter of faith. That's basically a third example, if you will, truth and authority. Christians seem to be willing to claim that their understanding of truth has authority because somehow they have a privileged access to the transcendent. And that's nuts. Christians claim to have a sense of a healthy relationship between God and humanity amongst itself, but that does not mean that we're epistemologically kind of lifted on some higher plane. Paul, for instance, knew that. We can talk about the transcendent as through a glass darkly. Now, a glass in those days, you could hardly see anything. It wasn't really a glass. It was more a sort of what you saw as a murky mess. And he used that as a metaphor for our epistemological limitations. How I wish that Christians in the academy and Christians in church got that basic point by Paul. I think Christians being in epistemological trouble, that is a problem. If you combine that with truth claims that Christians kind of foist upon others and others have to sign up to. We're going to be talking a lot more about this. See you soon.